It was, I think, in part because we had really effective leaders. And one of the things that those leaders did that was so effective was they realized that there were so many different parts to this change. It was going to be really important to help their organization understand at a high level as well as a granular level how the different things that were changing related to each other. So how does the change in the system relate to documentation, relate to process?
Welcome to Leadership Disrupted. I'm Dan Rust, and we welcome to the podcast today Mr. Pete Hess. And this conversation so excites me because we're going to focus on change management. And this is the Leadership Disrupted podcast, after all. And if this podcast had a spirit animal, I think it would be probably a caterpillar in the process of morphing into a butterfly. We are all about change and leading people through change. Pete Hess has over 25 years of experience in management consulting, applying his expertise in motivating behavior change, driving stakeholder engagement in change situations, and workforce development to support change efforts. And that cumulative experience has given Pete a really unique and deeply informed perspective. So welcome, Pete. It's good to see you. I'm really looking forward to this. And can you add just a little background or color commentary to your background, just so we can help everyone understand who you are and why change management is a particular area of interest to you?
Yep, absolutely. So thanks so much for the intro, and you make me sound really old. So we have to work on that a little bit. So I spent 25 years leading organizational change initiatives in organizations, mostly for-profit corporations, but some not-for-profit as well. And what interested me in it in the first place was that in workplaces there is always change, and change is accelerating. And if we implement change well, it's going to benefit the folks who actually have to get the jobs done in the organization. If we don't do it well, people's work lives are just not as good. So what really got me into it in the first place was, wanting to improve people's work lives. And also, since we're, talking about leadership, it was very clear to me even early on, 25 years ago, that effective leadership was absolutely essential especially for larger scale change projects. And to the point of the quote there, which you'll talk a little bit about, change is one of the core components of a leader's job, and has become more and more important as our world has accelerated, basically.
Well, and I think, as you and I have discussed before, when you really boil down the role of a leader and the core functions of a leader, change management, change leadership is definitely a big part of that core function, because leaders are always on the lookout for what needs to evolve, what needs to change, what is already evolving, and how do we catch up with whether it's the market, the customer, employees, whatever it might be. Leaders in their leadership roles, they are the orchestrators of change, either proactively, or if not proactively, then reactively when the change is thrust upon them, for sure.
And I think that, the other thing is, if you think of a leader's job, a lot of the behaviors that they need to exhibit in order to be effective change leaders are the same behaviors that they need for being effective day-to-day leaders, whether it's, setting a clear vision, aligning stakeholders, getting their team on board, communicating effectively. All that's basic blocking and tackling of leadership. There are some particular nuances when you're talking about a large scale change, or even a smaller change, but more specifically a large scale change. We can talk about some of those nuances, but to your point, it's what leaders should be doing on a day-to-day basis.
I do think, though, mastering the skills on a smaller scale is a great way for a leader to build that larger scale change muscle. I'm going to put something on the screen that is sort of my mental framework for when you're leading larger scale initiatives. Thinking through creating a shared need, shaping the vision of the change, mobilizing the commitment of multiple stakeholder groups, having a strategy for reinforcing and making the change last, and then monitoring progress. So that's kind of the mental model that I typically use. And then underlying all of that, ensuring that the structures and systems surrounding the change initiative actually reinforce it, actually support it, because it's not uncommon to do all of the things right, but then suddenly be derailed because it turns out, well, your incentive structure actually works in a different direction, or your technical systems work in a different direction, or some other aspect of your systems and structures is actually either incentivizing people or driving people in a different direction. So it isn't just the 5 stages, but actually ensuring that you are structured to support the 5 stages. But what I have often found is that even if you apply this sort of model, if the leaders who are driving the change lack the fundamental skill sets to create the shared need or to shape that vision, which is all about communication skills, all about understanding who is working with you and for you, understanding your stakeholders. Those fundamental skills are skills that we should be building small scale first. Those small day-to-day change initiatives. That's when it would make the most sense to me. Would love to hear your perspective on that, though.
Yeah, I definitely agree. I was just thinking of a project I had to shift how a customer service organization was facing off against its customers, and it involved changing structure, work processes, skills, etc. And the frontline leaders and the middle managers needed to help their folks understand where their function or their team was going, right? So they needed to be able to effectively encapsulate and communicate a vision. Well, the chief customer officer of that same organization also needs to form a vision and effectively communicate the vision, but it's a difference of scale and scope and degree of impact. And I think the other thing we haven't really talked about, and it somewhat relates to your model. So that model really focuses on what happens within a change project or a transformation project. One of the things that I've noticed that more effective change leaders do is they help people connect the dots. Especially these days, organizations are not going through just one change. They're going through multiple changes at the same time. And so leaders who can help people understand the context within which a specific change is happening, how that change relates to other things that are changing in the organization, and how all of that helps them to drive to, a more positive future for the organization, for teams, and for individuals. So I think that, yeah, go ahead.
It's easy for a leader to underestimate the amount of dot connecting that's required to be, optimal for an organization. Yeah. Because, of course, leaders tend to be, because they're at the hub of the change, oftentimes they've been involved in numerous conversations leading up to whatever the change might be. And they may take for granted that they've actually been thinking about this for weeks or months or years even. And all of that embedded knowledge seems so clear to them, so obvious to them. The dots have gotten connected over a period of time. And so then they feel like, well, I'm communicating clearly. Here is the change. Here is the reason for the change. How could it be in any way confusing? But in fact, oftentimes you have to connect the dots, as you said, again and again and again, and reinforce that communication, because it does give, depending upon the depth of the change initiative, but it does take time for people to mentally shift and connect dots.
Yeah, I mean, I'm sure you have seen the research that says that you have to communicate 7 times for somebody to really integrate the message, into their mental framework and be able to act on it. So to your point, just communicating once or twice is not going to really get it. And I think the other thing is there are different sort of levels or kinds of communications. More effective leaders are able to, during change, are able to build trust by
Mhm.
communicating directly with their direct reports, their stakeholders, et cetera. And they also have to be really good at communicating out to the broader organization in a way that's really clear, that's compelling, and that connects with people. And I think that's one of the mistakes that I've more often seen leaders make is they focus the case for change, the reason that the change is going on, very much in terms of what the organization needs to achieve, the organization's results. And it's not an either or. They have to focus on the organization's results and what's good for the organization, because that's why everybody works for the company. And they need to help people see themselves in the change. So it's both understanding that what the organization is driving to and how the change is going to have a positive impact on individuals, or if not a positive impact, address some of the pain points that they were feeling in the past.
The way it was explained to me years ago when I worked at GE, and GE was famous for their change management culture. I mean, they had a change management office, they had change management practitioners, and these were folks who had a lot of passion for change initiatives. And when we discussed communication, they would say, of course, we'll start with the what, like what is changing, but we quickly move into the why. And we spend a lot more time on the why than on the what. And then
Mhm.
once we have nailed the why, we spend a lot, even more time on the how, because we want to reinforce for people here is specifically how that is being implemented, not just for each individual, although we connect the dots for each individual, but we want them to see how the dots are connected for others as well. And giving large groups of people the respect of sharing the why with them. Here's why it's happening. Here's how it's going to be. Here's how it's going to be implemented. Here is what specifically impacts you. That takes time. It takes time. It takes energy. I think it probably even takes more today because we are all so inundated with
Mhm.
information.
Sure.
I thought I was suffering information overload 20 years ago. And then I remember 10 years ago thinking, man, it's gotten so much worse. And I think now it is unbelievable in terms of the amount of information that each of us is expected to process every single day. Emails, Teams messages, chat messages, phone
Mhm.
calls, Teams meetings, projects, all of these things. And that's just the work part. And work is being mixed in with the rest of our lives. So we're getting social media messages, news media messages, commercial media messages on our phones all of the time. Whenever I'm trying to stay focused on this, and I have to turn this thing off, because if I don't turn this off, it's going to ping me. But the moment I turn this back on, I'm flooded with a ton of information. So I think if that same research was done today, I'm wondering if it would actually show us that we need more than 7. Maybe we need, who knows, 10, 11, 12. Who knows what the number might be. But the point really is, if you're wondering if you've communicated your change initiative at enough depth, well enough, I would say assume the answer is no, and do it some
Right.
more. Just do it
Right.
some until you are in a meeting and you are about to hit one of the main points of the change initiative or the change rationale, and you see people's lips moving like they can repeat the words right along with you, like they know the song, or where it's clear that now it's embedded in their thinking, it's embedded in their psyche. I'd rather be accused of over communicating and have people like beg me, don't explain it again. We get it. I'd rather have that than
Right.
have people secretly wondering, why is this really happening, and how is this impacting others? When I'm going to share a slide because this particular slide talks about the typical failure patterns of leaders in driving a change initiative. And I've seen, I'm not sure you have as well, plenty of both patterns throughout my career. The first is being too much of a pusher, too dominating, meaning, when leaders are basically focusing on the what, just the what. Here's the what, here's what's changing. No emphasis on why. No giving, of a strategic vision, no creating a shared need. Basically, here's what I need you to do differently. You've got the instructions now. There should be no discussion. Just do it. And you can probably get away with that with small initiatives that don't require a lot of buy-in, where you're very tactically and directly just changing somebody's compliance requirements or whatever that might be. But for the most part, if you're not pulling people in and making them part of it, if you're not creating a shared vision, it's going to be a temporary effect, and people are going to snap back to whatever the old way was. But then at the other end of the spectrum, I have seen managers and leaders, because they're uncomfortable knowing that what I'm about to introduce to you, or what I'm going to be asking you to do, is going to be uncomfortable to you, or you're not going to like it. They actually try to mask or suppress. Hey, we're changing our systems, but we've done a lot of research and we don't expect there to be any speed bump at all. Or, hey, we're making a dramatic, or they won't use the word dramatic. Hey, we're making a mild change to some of our reward and recognition initiatives. Using that phrase when actually what you're doing is you're changing commission structure. And so, so there's potentially a big change that people are going to have a lot of anxiety about, but masking it or suppressing it, all that does is frustrate people, cause them to feel like you're not being transparent, cause them to create stories in their heads about, okay, what's really going on? If I can't trust them to be totally transparent, what's really happening? So both of these patterns tend to be pretty suboptimal. And at that mid-level, that's where we see leaders who step into the natural tension, communicate clearly, connect the dots directly. They don't mask, they don't back away from the harsh reality. If there is a brutal reality to the change, they embrace it. They simply say, hey, I know this is going to have this impact on you. Can't pretend otherwise. So we'll talk our way through it. But they don't pretend that there aren't any weeds in their garden, if there are, in fact, lots of weeds in their garden.
Yeah, it's funny. I was doing we were working on a reorganization, and there were going to be layoffs. It was a financial services firm, and I had read something, and it might have come from GE, that said that research has shown that the more effective leaders, especially during change, but whenever, are ones who will say to their folks, this is what I can tell you. This is what I can't tell you. This is what I'm not sure of yet, right? And for a lot of leaders, that's really scary. Like, they don't want to say, I'm not sure, or I don't know, I don't have all of the answers, and going to one of your first failure mode in terms of, being more domineering, the leader who is willing to appropriately say, this is where we're going. This is why we're going there. I need to engage you in how we're going there. To your point, you kind of mentioned that before. And also, here's some stuff that we just haven't figured out yet, right? And here's the time, if we can, if you can, here's the time frame within which we're going to figure it out, or here's how we're going to engage you or others in the organization in figuring it out.
And to say that proactively, without waiting for somebody to raise their hand or to ping you with a message saying, hey, well, what about? To be comfortable saying that proactively. But I also think what's uncomfortable for many leaders is that other phrase you use, which is, here's what I can't tell you. Being comfortable simply saying, here's what I can tell you, here is what's public, and then acknowledging that there are aspects of this that I can't yet be public with, or I can't yet share. finding that right leadership approach where you acknowledge it, and that's where you are asking people to some degree to trust you, and to some degree, if you've built a culture of trust, if you have a track record with them, they're probably more likely to trust you than if you haven't built that track record. And that goes back to building your change muscles with the small changes, the small projects, the small, day-to-day things, so that does prepare you for the larger initiatives, hopefully. One other thing you had shared with me, Pete, was this slide here that the essentially sponsor effectiveness correlates to project success. And what I took away from this was, essentially, so much of this is about the human leader. It's not the actual strategy itself. It's not the actual change itself. I mean, those, of course, those have an impact, but the effectiveness of the leader sponsor definitely is a huge factor in driving the success of many change projects.
Yeah. And I think this also illustrates that implementing effective change management practices, hopefully leaders are partnering with change management professionals who do this stuff for a living. Implementing effective change management on a project gets you better business results. It's not about being a nicer person or, we are trying to positively affect the business. And, we've talked about this. There's a clear difference between leaders who expect compliance, which is the top row in your failure mode, and leaders who understand that if I not only get people to comply with what we need in the future state, but strongly commit to it, on a personal basis, that those people are going to be more productive, they're going to be more engaged, and they're going to contribute more to the change and ultimately to the success of the organization. So what we're talking about is not nice to do stuff, it's need to do stuff. And the leaders who are more effective are ones who recognize that and recognize the role that they can play, because they can't and shouldn't do everything, right? For a higher level leader like that chief customer officer I was talking about, like, she can't go and talk to every single individual contributor. I mean, she could, but not a good use of her time. But understanding where the critical influence points are in the organization, where the leverage points are, where the business as usual work that's going on can be leveraged to help people understand the change, it is going to, it made her a more effective change leader.
When you have these one-on-one conversations, coaching sessions with leaders who are accountable for large change initiatives, are there any common aha moments when they have conversation with you that causes them to kind of shift their mindset in some way? Is there any wisdom that you find yourself consistently imparting or helping them change perspective that makes them more effective?
Yeah, I want to be careful about this. I wouldn't say imparting wisdom, because that would imply that I'm wise. But it's asking the right questions. So one of the questions is, how much productivity will you get from an individual if they're complying with, and then name the specific change they're trying to drive, versus if they truly commit to it. Like that sparks, that turns on the light bulb for a lot of leaders. I think the other thing is asking leaders, what do you need individuals to do in this change? What do their managers need to do in order to enable that? What do you as a leader need to do in order to enable those managers, right? I think that gets the leader to realize, number one, more clearly what their role is versus, other people below them. Also to realize that there are many different levels that need to be engaged. I mean, they know they have different levels in their organization, but the key is engaging those levels. They don't have to do all of it personally, but they have to set up the environment and the expectations and the mechanisms for that kind of thing to happen. So specific example is we were implementing a new system, and it kind of goes back to what you were saying. While we were focused on, it was Salesforce. So it was, implementing a system to help salespeople and others in the organization to sell better and to track all of their sales efforts. Well, it became really clear as we started to get into the project that there were going to be a number of changes coming along with that technology that was being implemented that had implications for people's roles, the kind of work they did, who they interacted with, how they talked to their customers. And what the leader agreed to do, which was really key, was to focus on the frontline leaders of the salespeople and to enable them to have the right conversations with their folks. So we developed a number of meetings in a box, and we trained those frontline leaders to conduct effective meetings with their teams to help their teams understand what was changing, why it was changing, what it meant for them, how they could effectively play during the change, et cetera.
Are you telling me you actually got salespeople to enter detailed data into Salesforce and not just have it all in their mental cloud, so to speak? Was that actually successful?
It was successful.
You're the one, because I've heard that there's one person who's been able to make that change happen in the world. So
I guess the question is it on time or not?
Yeah.
Right.
and how many nudges? Does it happen after 2 nudges or 20 nudges?
Yeah.
But in reality, and seriously, I think when salespeople have it explained to them, the why behind it, the big why behind it, it actually can be framed as, this is helping you. This is, by helping the company succeed, it creates more job security for you. It actually can help all of us grow, but it does require a change in habits, a change in patterns. And that simple behavior pattern of instead of finishing a sales engagement and then moving on, finishing a sales engagement and then capturing notes, capturing data, keeping everything up to date, is probably very counterintuitive, or just doesn't come naturally to many salespeople. And so without a thorough change explanation, you're not likely to get the kind of compliance that you're hoping to get,
and therefore more sales.
Yeah, absolutely.
Again, the other thing that was going through my mind in response to your question about being wise with leaders is helping leaders understand how to use their business as usual activities to drive and reinforce the change. Because a lot of times when I first started working with a leader, what I'll hear is like, I've got my day job. This change initiative is on top of the day job, right? I don't have the time and the bandwidth to do, Pete, what really needs to be done, what you're saying needs to be done from a leadership perspective. And I think it's comforting, kind of eye-opening when I ask, how can you, the managers reporting to you, others in the organization, leverage what they're currently doing to help people understand how the change relates to what they're currently doing? That enables you to communicate the right messages you want about the change, how it's going to, address some of the pain points that people are feeling, how it's going to provide some benefits to them in their job, and, benefits to the organization. But, being able to leverage all of your efforts, I think, is a relief. And it kind of gets back to, a point you raised in terms of, we just have so much information coming to us, right? That if we're just adding change message on top of that, without sort of integrating it into how people are doing their day-to-day work, it just feels more and more overwhelming.
One of the more interesting change management initiatives I've been a part of in the last few years is we have a client that is a regional utility company, and they decided to implement a change to their compliance standards, meaning in the past, when a frontline worker was found to be out of compliance with any safety protocol at all, they immediately were dinged, like they received some sort of notice in their record. There was some very tangible negative impact from the fact that, oh, you were, quote, caught not wearing the proper gloves. You were caught not wearing the proper vest. You were seen to be doing, something in non-compliance with safety standards. And they made a conscious shift toward a different approach to those non-compliance events, which would be when you are observed being out of compliance, your manager will engage in a dialogue with you to clarify, did you understand, the requirement itself? Were there circumstances around the situation that prevented you from accessing the right gloves or accessing the right, protective equipment, whatever that might be? And going through a series of questions in order to identify root causes as opposed to instill compliance. And they were certain that if they involved their workers at that level, they would actually get greater compliance. They would have a greater safety conscious environment. But what they found is when this new approach was deployed in some of their divisions, they had absolutely the intended effect. And in other divisions, there was no reduction in compliance notifications or lack of out of compliance notifications. And when they sort of deep dived into the parts of the organization that weren't showing any change, like things were, even though the managers had communicated this new approach and were using this new approach, in those divisions where there was no actual change in safety compliance metrics, what they found was that those managers communicated a very different why. In fact, they didn't communicate a why at all. Those managers simply started doing things differently, basically not being as firm in terms of holding people to account. They just went soft. Whereas for those divisions that had the intended effect, managers explained the why. They explained the why behind this, and the primary why was because when you are found to be out of compliance with some safety protocol, we don't want our initial assumption to be you intentionally did something wrong. We want our initial assumption to be something within the system is not enabling you to do what you want to do, which is to do something right. And so we want to have more of an open, transparent dialogue with you. And our goal is to actually reduce, out of compliance incidents by having more open dialogue and not having the fear that you're going to be dinged or there's going to be some immediate costs. We would rather, if you show up to a work site and you don't have the proper gloves, we would rather you go to your supervisor and say, I just realized I forgot my gloves at home. Or I just realized, or we want you to feel more comfortable going to your supervisor and say, I noticed the 4 guys on that crew over there, they're not wearing the right X. Because you're generally not going to say that if you know that they're going to get dinged. But if you internalize this new environment, you're much more likely to be very open regarding that kind of communication. And yet, so this is a great example where not communicating the why behind it actually made that change initiative a failure for certain divisions. And it was all because they really hadn't explained to those frontline leaders the need to communicate the why. So some divisions just got it. They got it instinctively, and they communicated that properly. But it did tell me that these change initiatives, they're oftentimes a lot more complex and subtle in terms of human behavior than we realize. Of course, we wish we would just say, hey, press the red button from now on, not the yellow. Press the red, not the yellow. You're still going to have some people go, you mean the yellow? No. The red button, not the yellow. Oh, not the yellow. Right, not the yellow. Don't look. I mean, as simple as it is, it still has to be communicated, then over communicated.
Yeah, kind of brings up 2 points for me. One is I always remember the phrase, and I don't know where this comes from. You take a good person and you put them in a bad system, the system wins every time. And then I think the second thing is, and I don't know if you've noticed this, Dan, but there's when somebody goes from being an individual contributor to a manager, there's like an auto forget circuit. Like the manager forgets what it's like to be an individual contributor and not to have clear direction, not understand why they're doing something, not, have a manager who's clearing roadblocks out of the way.
Mm-hmm.
So going back to your question about how do what do I talk about with leaders? There's probably less so with top leaders, although this also happens that top leaders get so embedded in their broad view of the organization that they miss the focus on the individual and the team, and how important those elements are. But more for the frontline leaders and the middle managers, helping put themselves back into, or helping to put them into their individual contributor role, or put that hat on, create some real ahas in terms of those middle manager leaders or frontline leaders' willingness and ability to take a little bit more time to work with their folks to help them understand the why and the what and the how.
Absolutely. So I wanted to bring up what might be kind of a touchy subject. The subject is what happens when the actual change initiative is maybe not the wisest one in the world, maybe not the one, maybe not the change that makes the most sense. I've seen situations where a leader will implement a change in process. Let's just say a change in process, and initially ignores the complaining and the grumbling because he or she is certain, hey, this new process is what makes sense. And only after a fair amount of feedback and pushback does the leader realize, oh, okay, all right, that process doesn't quite make sense, or that's creating some more work. And so then the leader, quickly changes to a different process. But in that process of changing to like a new set of instructions, a new change initiative, if you don't acknowledge your mistake, if you don't say, hey, folks, clearly we had a situation where this wasn't thought through as thoroughly as it should have been, and we're sorry about that. Sorry for wasting the time. And we are really appreciative of the feedback so that we can inform our new process with your experience on the ground. If you don't do that, I think leaders underestimate the credibility loss. Every time there's a change initiative that the field just goes, really? So why are we doing this? Okay, I'll comply, but I still don't understand why. And then 3 months later, it changes because someone somewhere realized, oh, there were implications to that change that we didn't realize what those implications might be. And so there are some leaders who have shot themselves in the foot enough times where now, even when they come forward with a very valid, well thought through change initiative, the initial mindset of the workforce is suspicion, because things haven't been thought through thoroughly enough. And I know that doesn't happen all the time. Hopefully it doesn't happen often at all. But when it does happen, my strong recommendation to leaders is that you transparently own it and just say, hey, here's how we got to that. Here's what was happening. Here's how we came to the conclusion that we did. And we clearly had a miss. And now we're refining it.
Dan, I'm sorry. I think even before that, what's really critical is that the leader think through how they're framing the change. So to be more concrete about it, if you're talking about project management, traditional project management is waterfall. So we plan everything out. We know the date that we're going to hit. The assumption is that stuff's not going to happen along the way. Or if it's going to happen, we plan for it, right? We've shifted over the last number of years to a more agile approach where we set something up, we pilot it, we get feedback, we adjust, right? And leaders, I think, who frame a change as this is the direction we're going, this is where we want to end up, we know that we're going to have to make adjustments as we go along. So we're going to do some stuff. We're going to figure out how well it worked and what we need to change. We're going to keep modifying. If you frame it that way up front, you're setting the expectation on the part of your people that this is not going to be all, well planned out, completely, thoroughly, thought through, that we're going to have to figure it out together. As long as you've got that clear North Star, this is where we need to end up and why.
I love that. So the change initiative is also framed as a learning initiative. We're going to change, and we're going to learn through the process. And as we gather that learning, change will cascade. We'll have iterations of change going forward, potentially, depending on how things work out. When do you see yourself, like, when have you typically been pulled into a conversation with a leader? Is it typically before a major change initiative is being launched, or is it after a change initiative was launched and maybe things didn't go great and now they're trying to get a do-over, so to speak? Or how do those conversations typically even occur, where they bring you into the conversation?
Right. So both, right? I've had both kinds of conversations. One, usually with more sophisticated organizations, sophisticated both in terms of how they manage change, but also sophisticated in terms of their processes, their systems, and their expectations of leadership. And in those situations, up front, we're thinking through, okay, so here's what needs to happen on the project. How are we going to make sure that we're bringing people along as we're implementing the project, so that when we press go, when we go live, they're ready, willing, and able. On the other side, I've been brought in a number of times, typically with like less sophisticated organizations, less mature organizations, where they start implementing a project, typically with very light or no change management, and it just ain't going well, right? And the noise level has gotten to the point where the leaders understand that it's not going well, which kind of goes back to something that we were talking about. I think the one other thing that better leaders do is they get data and make decisions based on the data in terms of how people are reacting to the change. So you talked about people raising concerns, raising issues, and not being heard. The more effective change processes that I've helped implement are ones where there's clear measurement, and we turn the qualitative, like go out and ask people how the change is going, what's working well, what's not. So that's qualitative. If you sum that across 1,000 people, 2,000 people, 30,000 people going through a major change in an organization, then the leader starts paying attention. That's real data. That's quantitative data, because you can say, hey, Ms. or Mr. Leader, 60% of your folks are saying that the project is behind. The reason it's behind is because functions are not coordinating with each other, right? 65% of your folks are saying that. Is that something that's valid for you? Oh, absolutely. 65% of my folks are saying that cross-functional work is not happening well. We've got to address that. So I think that data piece is something we haven't talked about, but it's really, really important.
So then let's assume something like that happens. How do you do root cause analysis to ensure that you understand the actual reason why those things are happening, not just because the metric is not the problem. The metric is the indicator of the problem. And a lot of times we try to fix our metrics, but in fact, we're not going deep enough to understand the root causes underneath those metrics.
Yeah. So it might be too easy of an answer, but implementing quantitatively oriented measurement, so implementing surveys or polls or what have you, and then getting that data and saying, okay, so we've got some issues that we think are of concern. Now we need to go and talk to folks and say, hey, Dan, you mentioned that cross-functional coordination is not really happening very well on the project. Give me a couple of examples of that, so we can start digging under the surface and getting to root cause. So I think you need both of those things.
So I worked with a client a few years ago where they started with the initial problem they presented was unplanned employee turnover was too high in some areas of the business. So they had determined, based on employee feedback, that the issue was with their managers, and their managers were not engaged enough in the career development conversations with those employees. And so they implemented a change initiative where they tracked the amount of hours managers spent engaging with employees on their careers. And they encouraged managers to spend a minimum of, I think it was 2 hours per month. It could be 4 30-minute meetings. It could be 1 2-hour meeting, but to spend 2 hours per month having conversations with the employee regarding the employee's career, the career trajectory, the employee's growth. Well, they got 100% compliance with that initiative, and retention didn't change at all. And the challenge was that while they addressed the metric on the surface, so managers started spending more time, they didn't really address the root cause. And ultimately the root cause, as you peel the layers away, was ultimately the managers didn't see their job in the same way that employers saw the manager's job. Employees. Employees were looking for a leader who was a coach, a guide, a mentor, who wanted to spend that time, who was interested and motivated to engage with the employee and help them with their career trajectory. Whereas most of the frontline managers and supervisors just wanted to deliver results. That was just that it was an engineering organization. That was their culture. Just get results done, deliver results. So ultimately when they finally came to accept the root causes, there was a solution, but it was a much deeper solution. It was a much more deep manager development solution to help managers build empathy, develop connections with their employees, which took much more time. But they would have never gotten to that point if they had just focused on the metrics and not been willing to go underneath the metrics to the root causes underlying it.
Yeah.
In your experience, are there any notable success stories, or the opposite, any notable challenging stories that you've either been a part of or observed or heard about that could be valuable just for us to know and learn?
Sure. The difficult ones are more numerous than I can think of. The one success story I can think of is working with a worldwide insurer, and this was a few years ago when the EU had passed the GDPR, General Data Protection Rules, and organizations that did business in EU had to comply with them, and it meant that they had to make changes top to bottom in their organization, their documentation, their policies, their procedures, their systems, et cetera, et cetera. And it was a hugely successful project, I think in part because we had really effective leaders. And one of the things that those leaders did that was so effective was they realized that there were so many different parts to this change. It was going to be really important to help their organization understand at a high level as well as a granular level how the different things that were changing related to each other. So how does the change in the system relate to documentation, relate to process? So they put in place a process where during the normal course of business, people could carve out a little bit of time, focus on the part of their business that was changing, that was relevant for them, and then have a forum where those things were shared. So people got much smarter about all of the different changes that were going on. In terms of the ones that haven't gone well, I think that I'd go back to that chart that you showed about the failure modes. um, the changes that were less effective were ones where the leaders were, clearly domineering or clearly like just stepping back and letting the change happen.
I think that there's a subtle benefit to being in an environment of continuous change, because I've worked with organizations where either because they were entrepreneurial and their world was changing and evolving all the time anyway, or they happened to be in a market that was continuously evolving and changing. For them, they had no choice but to build those change muscles. And so then when every new evolution, every new change that comes down, they already have those muscles. But the danger zone is really with organizations that have been in a pretty stable environment for 3 years, 5 years, 10 years. And generally, if they've been in a stable market, I worked for a business that actually had a customer base that probably hadn't changed in 50 years. Very stable, mainline American business. And suddenly, for the first time since, like, nobody in the business could remember consumer behaviors changing that way, the way they were starting to change, because for the entire careers of everyone in the business, people had always behaved in a certain way. And it was actually a company that manufactured high school and college class rings and graduation caps and gowns. Well, I mean, talk about a stable behavior. There was a time, you go back 20 years, there was a time when, of course, everyone who graduated got their cap and gown. Everyone who graduated, you get your class ring, you get all of those things. It was just a standard behavior. And then suddenly those patterns started changing pretty rapidly, and no one really knew what to do. No one knew how to respond. So ultimately, the point of the story is that for this particular organization, because they had worked in such a stable environment for so long, this change rocked them for a couple of years. It took them the longest time to finally get realigned, and ultimately it created so many business challenges that they ended up having a few years of really tough financials. They got acquired. Lots of changes were thrust upon them because they couldn't manage through a consumer behavior change effectively, while some of their competitors were evolving pretty rapidly. Now, last thing, Pete, and this is just because I know that you personally have a deep passion for the subject of climate change and helping both individuals and organizations, manage their mindset, their perspective, and their actions related to climate initiatives. I would just love for you to tell us a little bit about that and how you bring your change management expertise to that very important topic.
Yeah, thanks so much for asking. We could spend a whole session on that, obviously. So a couple things. I'll start with your last point first. When the environmental movement first started up, and for its first, 10, 15 years, there was quite a bit of focus on the negative, all of the negative stuff that was going to happen because of climate change. And there was a focus on sort of broad, big issues like, the glaciers are melting and polar bears are going to have a tough time. And from a change management perspective, we know that we have to hit people where they live. So we found that, and there's a lot of research that backs this up now, if we don't focus on communicating a message that we want to communicate about climate change, we do focus on what's important to the people in their lives, what concerns they have, and then relate climate change to those concerns. And it's a lot easier these days with, the fires that we see and the flooding that we see, et cetera. But helping people connect to what's going on in their day-to-day lives is really, really important. One of the main messages that resonates really, really well is, questions. asking people about their kids and their grandkids and what kind of world they want their kids and grandkids to live in, right? And that really hooks people. The second thing, Dan, that's really, really critical is simplify.
Mhm.
Climate change is really complex. There's a lot of stuff that contributes to climate change. It has a lot of impacts on a lot of different aspects of our lives and the world. And so there was research around what phrasing would be effective. So this is real tactical. And what they found was one of the most effective ways to frame a conversation around climate change is it's real, it's us, it's fixable, right? Number one, it's happening. 9,000 scientists across the world agree it's happening, right? It's pretty clear. We got a lot of data about it. We know that humans are primarily responsible for climate change while there are other factors that go into it, right? It's us. And the third thing is the most important, because with all of the negatives that come along with it, people can get real depressed and anxious. And, we need to have hope. And part of the hope is it's fixable. And there's actually some really great stuff going on, whether you want to talk about solar or wind or EVs or, people buying induction stoves and, heat pumps. So helping people to see that they can have some agency, they can address it, and we all can address it. Like, it's not too late. Those are a couple of things.
Let me ask you a tough question that I think a person might ask. If we in the West can't get China to change their behavior, because China is a huge contributor, if we can't get India to change their behavior because they are a huge contributor, so there are these massive contributors to greenhouse gases that even if we make modest adjustments in our behaviors in the West, it's like I don't want to say a drop in the ocean, but perhaps not a significant impact because of these other huge contributors.
Mm-hmm.
So how do you think about that? Now, first of all, if I'm wrong, you just tell me I'm wrong. But but how do you think about persuading people in the West to change their behaviors, to change their actions, if it feels like, well, no matter what we do, unless they change theirs, it almost isn't going to make a significant difference at all?
Yeah, that's probably one of the toughest things around trying to address climate change is some of the actions that we need to take are big action. We need to stop using fossil fuels, right? That's a big thing.
Yeah.
Our economy, the world's economy, runs on fossil fuels. And so two things come up for me, at least. One is it's not either or, it's both and. China needs to address stuff. The US needs to address stuff. Small islands need to address stuff. So, it's not, if China fixed what they need to fix, if they stop using all the coal that they're using, we would adjust. We would be in a much better position. So it's the either or thinking that I think makes it a little bit more difficult. And then
I had someone a few months ago say to me, a really smart guy, he said, look, every one of these countries does what they do for their purposes because ultimately it makes economic sense. That energy is cheaper to them, and it's important to them to have the most cost-effective energy. But there are a lot of initiatives because of all of the mental energy around climate change. There are a lot of really interesting initiatives right now to generate clean energy more cost effectively, whether that is small nuclear reactors, small fusion reactors, high capacity solar power, wind power. He said, so you're seeing that the economics of these alternative energies are evolving. And of course, like many new things, they're expensive when they start. But once you can expand at scale, there will come a point where alternative non-fossil fuel energy is in fact more cost effective than drilling for oil or drilling for fossil fuels. And at that point, you're going to see, without even a lot of push, you're going to see dramatic shifts. But you won't have that development if you don't have the West leading the way, or the more developed countries leading the way in terms of those technologies. And honestly, what that did for my engineer's brain is it gave me a compelling reason to say, okay, that makes sense. Invest in the technologies, invest in the development, and ultimately, there's a future that's going to look different, and not because those other countries are making immediate changes now. But in any event, I think it's a fascinating example of managing change, both on the good side and the challenging side, because there are so many different perspectives and points of view, and you're trying to manage a global change. This is not, hey, how do we get kids to buy more high school class rings? This is, how do we change the planet? So you would expect it to be a massive change. So Pete, thank you. This is fantastic. A really good conversation. I really appreciate this. And hopefully we'll get a chance in the future to have other conversations about other topics, because I know you are a deep well of expertise in a lot of things related to business management, business development, and employee development in general. So thank you. This has been a lot of fun. Appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks so much for inviting me. I really enjoyed it, Dan. Looking forward to continuing the conversation.
Bye now.